Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the British Scholars Association of Sri Lanka, I am pleased to welcome you for this presentation. The British Scholars Association was established in 1985 with the support and cooperation of the British Council, and it is open to any person who has studied in UK to become a member. During the last few years, we had several activities, including special lectures by our guests. And today, it's with great pleasure I introduce to you Dr. Indrajit Coomarasway, the Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka since July last year. He was an official in the Central Bank of Sri Lanka from 1974 to 1989. He worked in the economic research, statistics, and bank supervision divisions. During this time, he was also seconded to the Minister of Finance and Planning from 1981 to 1989. Dr. Coomarasway obtained his BA Honours and Masters in Economics from the Cambridge University of United Kingdom in 1972 and subsequently obtained a doctorate from the University of Sussex, UK in 1981. Dr. Coomarasway has over 30 years experience in policy making and providing economic advisory services on both macroeconomic and structural issues at national and intergovernmental level. He has served as the Director of Economic Affairs at the Commonwealth Secretariat. He was re-employed by the Commonwealth Secretariat from 1990 to 2008. During that time, he held positions of Director, Economic Affairs Division, and Deputy Director, Secretary General's Office in the Commonwealth Secretariat. He was subsequently appointed as Interim Director, Social Transformation Program Division of the Secretariat in 2010. He was involved in advising the Prime Minister and the Minister of Economic Reform, Science and Technology, Sri Lanka, on negotiating with Bretton Woods Institution and other major donors, and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka and the Minister of Finance and Planning on matters relating to macroeconomic and structural reforms. He has led Sri Lanka national rugby team in 1974 in Rugby Asia, while he also played first-class cricket in Sri Lanka and for the Cambridge University. Dr. Coomarasway has been named Central Bank Governor of the Year, South Asia by the popular publication house Global Capital at Global Capital Markets Award ceremony in Washington, D.C. in October 2017, which coincided with the World Bank IMF annual meetings. Global Capital is a leading news opinion and data service for people and institutions working in the international capital markets. Dr. Coomarasway has consented to speak to us. He will be speaking on Advancing Vision 2025.
Thank you, Professor. Good evening. That was a very generous introduction. It's going to be challenging to live up to it. But let me try and quickly give you an outline of what I propose to say this evening. This is an attempt to reference back to the Government's Vision 2025 document, which sets out the framework for development in the medium term. I want to start by initially talking a little bit about what is being done to strengthen the macroeconomic fundamentals. I mean, that's the bread and butter of the central bank. Central bank and the finance ministry have primary responsibility for that. So talk a little bit about what's being done on that front. Then to talk about how the growth model that is embedded in the Vision 2025 document, more about what is being done to strengthen the growth framework, and to give you a thumbnail sketch of some of the government's major development programs. So let me start with the macroeconomic fundamentals. What is really the idea is to set in place some clear frameworks within which macroeconomic policy formulation will take place. Because historically we have tended to have rather ad hoc policies and repeating stop-go cycles and a lot of the instability in terms of the macro fundamentals stemmed from the government's budgetary operations. So this has meant that we started off second to Japan on most indicators at the time of independence in Asia. Now, of course, we've slipped well down the pecking order. And one of the reasons has been the fact that we have not been able to maintain sound macroeconomic fundamentals. But when you don't have that, then you don't have the predictability and consistency in the policy framework to encourage the kind of investment that's necessary to drive development. So it becomes critical that you have these clear-cut frameworks to set policy, particularly in terms of the budget, which has been the main source of instability. And here the government has a revenue enhancement-driven fiscal consolidation program, which envisages that the budget deficit will come down to 3.5% of GDP by 2020. And as I said, the primary focus will be on driving revenue up. Our overall expenditure at about 20% of 20% of GDP is actually comparable with our comparator countries, our peer group countries at a similar age of development, similar rating. They spend about 20% of GDP. So the overall level of expenditure is okay. Of course, the quality of expenditure can be improved. We can align expenditure more clearly with our national priorities. So that can be done, but the overall level is okay. But what has happened is that our revenue collapsed. In the past, the government used to collect 20% of GDP. When I worked in the finance ministry in the 80s, and it regularly collected over 20% of GDP as revenue. However, that collapsed or reduced, came down to 12% of GDP by 2014, 2015. And that was because, one of the reasons, one of the main reasons, was the fact that the government had to give away a lot of revenue by way of concessions to promote investment in the country at a time when there was a very high war risk premium attached to the economy. So to get projects over the hurdle rate of return, the government had to give massive concessions, which meant that the revenue declined. The last couple of years, in 2016 and this year, we have seen revenue being built up again, and this year it will probably end up at about 14.7% of GDP. And the idea is to get it up to 16% by 2020, and with expenditure at 19-20%, that 3.5% overall deficit is very achievable. And so far the government has made good progress since about April 2016. The Inland Revenue Act and the reform to the VAT system were politically very difficult, but they have now strengthened the revenue base. The Inland Revenue Act has simplified the tax system and it has widened the base, and VAT has actually brought in a lot of revenue already, additional revenue already. And the increase in revenue that we've seen in the last year or so has been to a significant extent due to the increased collections from VAT. So the government is making progress. At the moment, I mean, there's been some slippage because of natural disasters, because of the drought and the floods. But the IMF, which has fiscal targets, has been flexible enough to accommodate some additional expenditure and a slightly larger budget for this year because of the additional relief expenditure that has had to be incurred. But broadly, the fiscal consolidation is on track. Now, as I said, not only are these frameworks being put in place, but it's important to institutionalize them so that there is durability. Because in the past too, we've had instances when governments have done better as far as fiscal management is concerned, but then a few years down the line, particularly when elections came, things all deteriorated. So how the institutionalization is being attempted is the government already has a Fiscal Responsibility Management Act, which sets certain limits, a limit of 3% of GDP for the budget deficit and 60% of GDP for public debt. At the moment it's 79%. Now, but this was introduced in 2002, 2003, but since then no government has really adhered to these targets. So the idea now is to try to give some teeth to this Fiscal Responsibility Management Act, and to have very specific reasons why or when you can deviate from the target. Like, for instance, natural disasters and the government has to spend money, or you have a severe depression because there is an exogenous shock, the oil price goes to the roof and the economic activity collapses and you have to have public spending to boost activity. So you specify reasons why you can deviate, and when you deviate, you have to set out a clear path as to how you will come back. So that is the kind of check and balance that is being considered by the government to give teeth to this Fiscal Responsibility Management Act. So there's a fiscal consolidation path set out, and hopefully there will be institutionalization of certain targets within which the government has to operate. Similarly, in the central bank, we are introducing the flexible inflation targeting regime, which we will be setting all this out in the central bank's roadmap, which will come out on the 3rd of June. Essentially, it enables us to have a much more data-driven, forward-looking, proactive monetary policy. In the past, there has been considerable fiscal forbearance. The government, the central bank accommodated the fiscal profligacy of the government, often by just printing money. But if you have a flexible inflation targeting regime, you have a clear target of 4 to 6%, and the idea is to have a legal and accountability framework within which this target has to be administered. Now, in extreme cases, for instance, in New Zealand, who are the pioneers in this inflexible inflation targeting, the central bank governor has to resign if the target is missed. So I'm not sure whether we'll have this yet, but it's the kind of, and also in Indonesia, if the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act is not adhered to, the finance minister has to resign. So, these are some of the kind of checks and balances that would be useful. I don't know whether we'll get as far as that, but the idea is to have these frameworks and the institutionalization of these frameworks through legal and accountability measures. The exchange rate, historically we've always had an overvalued exchange rate. We've tried to protect an overvalued exchange rate, mainly because effectively what an overvalued exchange rate does, it subsidizes inflows. Because you basically get it cheaper than you would have with a realistic exchange rate. And it's politically expedient to do that, because there are many more consumers than there are producers. While you are subsidizing the consumers with an overvalued exchange rate, you actually end up penalizing producers, particularly exporters and producers of import competing goods. So there is only a limit to how far you can do this, because we in the past we have protected the exchange rate by using very scarce reserves, external reserves. After a while, it just does not hold. You can't hold it. And for instance, in 2010-11, we spent almost $4 billion to protect the exchange rate, and at the end, we depreciated by 15%. Then in 2015, under this government, we spent over $2 billion to protect the exchange rate, and in the end, depreciated by about 10 or 12%. So it's just a no-brainer. You can't do it. So you have to have a more flexible exchange rate. And how you protect the value of the rupee is by having prudent policies whereby you don't allow your inflation rate to go well above those of your competitors and trading partners. Because if your inflation is much higher, if your costs are going up much higher than those of your competitors, you clearly lose markets and you can't sustain that. Equally, in your markets, if your prices are going up faster, you're not competing to sell in those markets either. So you have to be competitive in terms of both your markets as well as your competitors. And so a competitive exchange rate is critical if we are to essentially promote growth, promote employment generation, and pay back our debt. I'll come to that later. But so clearly, a competitive exchange rate is critical. I will say a little bit more about how critical it is in a minute. So what we're doing now is there are certain parameters within which we're going to manage the exchange rate. These are well accepted parameters. A number of other countries do it. And we will again set this framework up to manage the exchange rate. And the fourth area where we're trying to put in a framework is liability management. Sri Lanka is probably right now the real Achilles heel is our debt dynamics. Our debt to GDP is 79%. Our rating peers, countries with a similar rating to us, the median is 45. So with 45 is the median, we're 79. So clearly that is a major problem. And our debt servicing is going to be a serious challenge going forward. Next year, we have a massive peak in our domestic debt servicing. And then we have a bunching of our external debt repayments from 2019 onwards. Let me take each of those in turn. Now, fortuitously for us, in the last 5 months of this year, there were no debt maturities. So we've been able to raise money. We're going to try to raise a war chest of about 100 to 110 billion, which will help us to manage the debt servicing next year. So we think we can manage it, but it is a challenge. And obviously, when you have the government needs that large amounts of resources, it puts pressure on interest rates. So that's domestic debt. On external debt, from 2019 onwards, these international sovereign bonds that we've been taking over the last, since 2010, there is a maturity every year. So there is at least $1 billion which matures. And the peak is, I think, 2025 when there is $2.1 billion. So we have to find $1 billion to pay back. Now, what we're trying to do is two things. One is, at the moment, the Appropriation Act limits the borrowing you can take in any given year to the budget deficit. So you can only borrow to finance the government's borrowing requirement in any given year. Which means that you can't raise additional money to service this external debt. So there's a liability management bill with the legal draftsman, and hopefully it will be enacted early next year, which will enable the government to go beyond the borrowing requirement for the budget. We will set a cap for particular reasons, that is for liability management. So this will give us the capacity to borrow a little extra for liability management, to buy back some of the debt falling due from 2019 onwards. But we do also do switching, that is to tell people, okay, you buy the debt falling due in 2019 or 2020 and give them another 10-year bond so that you postpone the payment out to 2029 and 2030 to create some space, a breathing space. So those are the kinds of liability management techniques that the central bank will use. But the bigger objective, and I've just come from a meeting where the government has confirmed that it's going to do this, is that the money mobilized through divestiture or long leases of public assets will be earmarked for liability management, for debt servicing only. So the $1.1 billion from Hanmanthota will be put into an account in the central bank, a Deputy Secretary of the Treasury account in the central bank, and will be used only for debt repayment. Similarly, Mattala or hotels or anything else the government divests, when there is foreign money mobilized, that money will be put into an account, and the money will be dedicated for debt servicing. So that is actually a major plus, because that will enable us to pay down some of the debt. The other techniques of liability management is essentially getting breathing space, to move, to extend the tenor, to enable us in the meantime to increase our capacity to earn foreign exchange, to boost our exports and our repayment capacity and pay off. That's one way. The other way, of course, is to mobilize these resources through the sale of assets, which can then be used to reduce the debt. So those are the kind of four frameworks in the macroeconomic policy making area that the government is adopting to give a sound foundation in terms of the fundamentals of the economy. Now, as far as the growth model is concerned, I mean, what's embedded in the Vision 2025 document is that growth has to be driven by the private sector. Now, if you look around the world, there are different mixes of the private sector and the state which give you good development outcomes. You have China and Vietnam at one end and more market-oriented countries at the other. But in our case, our public debt dynamics is such that the state can't be the major catalyst of development. There just isn't the fiscal space for the government to lead the development effort. Of course, you can do PPPs, and I'm not saying the government opts out, but it can't drive the development process in the way a country like China did, because their public debt was extremely low. Vietnam, same. So they have the fiscal space to do that. In our case, we don't have that. So it's not an ideological thing to say that the private sector has to be the locomotive of development in this country. We have no choice. It's just a pragmatic conclusion one has to come to. So it's private sector driven. And also, exports and foreign direct investment have to be key pillars. Exports, because you can't, with a domestic market of 21 million people and purchasing power of about now almost $4,000, you can't drive 6% plus growth for 5-10 years, as the successful countries of East and Southeast Asia have done, by selling only to this market. So you essentially have to export, to go out. Now, what has been a major problem in the last 10-12 years is that our exports declined dramatically. They were 33% of gross domestic product in 2000. They were about 27% in 2005. They declined to 12.7% in 2016. Now, what was particularly counterproductive was the fact that this decline in exports happened at the same time when from 2010 onwards we went out on a binge of foreign commercial borrowing. So this combination of allowing exports to decline and at the same time to go and borrow commercially abroad is clearly has put us into the kind of hole we're in today. It just doesn't add up. There was a major problem. So now we really have to build up our exports. Otherwise, we can't get out of this problem in a sustained way. So we need exports to drive growth. We need exports to generate sufficient employment, and we need exports to have a sustainable debt profile. So clearly, exports are crucial. And if you look around the successful countries of East and Southeast Asia, whether they've been as large as China or small as Singapore, foreign direct investment has played a major role in their export transformation. Because foreign investment not only fills your savings investment gap, but it gives you technology, it gives you market access, it gives you know-how. So clearly you need FDI to support this export expansion. So the model is essentially private sector driven with exports and FDI as two key pillars. So now what's being done to strengthen this? That's the growth model. What's being done to strengthen the growth framework? And there are a number of things. One is what economists call factor markets. That's the land market, the labor market, and the capital market. And here there are things being done on each of those fronts. The land market, the government is looking into the land titling. It is also looking at some of the old land laws. Now, it is possible, in my view, to produce all the paddy we need in the dry zone using high-yielding varieties and good cultivation practices. Because in the wet zone, there has been a tremendous fragmentation of land holdings. The number of holdings of less than an acre are, I can't remember the proportion, but it is very, very high. So these are basically unviable agricultural plots. But people keep going, A, because of the law which says you can't use the land for anything other than paddy, and B, we give free water, we give a fertilizer subsidy, and we give a guaranteed price. Now, supporting agriculture is okay, but what we are really doing is we are trapping these farmers in low productivity, low income livelihoods. And because of that, our absolute headcount poverty level is very low, it's 4.4. And that poverty level is on the basis of a poverty line of about $1.90. If you increase the poverty line to $2.50, just $2.50 is what? 375 rupees a day. If you increase it to $2.50, almost 30% of the population lives below that. So what we are doing is we are essentially helping people to get their nose above water, but then they're trapped. They don't have pathways to go up. So clearly what we need to do is to create higher productivity, higher income jobs, and shift people gradually. Because people are behaving very rationally with all these subsidies and the guaranteed price, etc. And people are able to survive, so they stay there. Particularly if they can't sell their small plot of paddy because it can't be used for anything else. Otherwise, if it can be sold, they could, for commercial agriculture or higher value agriculture, they could sell the land and open a shop or go as labor into a factory, etc. But for that, of course, you have to create other forms of employment. That you have to, and factory jobs need to pay sufficiently for them to be incentivized to move. So in terms of the labor, but the land market is concerned, I've started with land. We need to see how we look at the land use, crop mix, etc. in a fundamental way to increase productivity in our agriculture sector. At the moment, agriculture accounts for 27% of the workforce and gives us 7% of GDP. So that is how low productivity in agriculture is. So clearly we need to address it. It's politically extremely difficult. There's no way you can take away these subsidies overnight. But I think if you have to have a vision of a faster growing economy, generating higher value jobs, gradually we need to change these incentives which are actually trapping people in low productivity, low income employment. But that's a long-term solution, a long-term process. Then as far as labor is concerned, people say that there is a labor shortage. in my view, it's not that we have labor shortage, but we have too much labor in the wrong places. As I said, 27% of the population in agriculture giving us just 7% of GDP. Now, there is a team from Harvard, the Center for International Development, working in Sri Lanka at the moment. And they think that for a country with our economic characteristic, our level of development, we should have 15% of our population in agriculture. So that other 12% is a surplus, which can be available for these factories which say that they don't have enough labor. For businesses in Colombo which are saying they don't have enough labor. So it's not that there's a shortage, but there are people in the wrong place, and they are staying in the wrong place because we have these incentives which are distorting their choices. Then again, another area of surplus labor is the public service. Public service now has 1.5 million people. It had 800,000 in 2005-06. So it almost doubled. Of course, 100,000 of that I think was the armed forces which had to be done. But still there was this dramatic increase in the public service. And I think, 800,000 was probably too many. So having 1.5 million, again, extremely rational. Because it's only the public servants of all the people in the workforce who have a pension, and not only a pension, but a non-contributory pension. So it makes absolute sense for people to want to work in the public service, which is what they do, and they put enormous pressure on their politicians to get jobs, and the politicians create these jobs, which are totally unproductive. So really what we need to do, and this is what the government is trying to do, is to have a national pension scheme. If everybody has a pension, then the special attraction of going into the public service becomes much less of a compulsion. People are behaving rationally in doing this. But so what we need to do is to change the incentives so that we can channel labor into more productive areas. And of course, people going abroad. I mean, clearly they get us a lot of remittances, but there are lots of social costs. Now, the Chinese ambassador told me that they can create jobs which would pay $500 a month in Hanwant when they start their industrial zones. So that's roughly over 75,000 rupees a month. Now, if that is so, then people will be willing not to go abroad, and if they have a national pension, not to go to the public service, and maybe shift from agriculture into those kinds of jobs. So if we can create jobs which pay $400-500 a month, then clearly the picture changes. And that's what we need to try and do. The other thing about labor, our current labor laws, is that it is, in my view, lowering the overall labor standards in the country. Because we do have very stringent labor laws, and it protects the formal sector employees. But what is happening is that lots of companies are circumventing the labor laws by casualizing their labor force. They're employing people on a casual basis. So that is lowering labor standards. Equally, people in the informal sector are reluctant to move into the formal sector, despite the fact that that may give them more credit and more access to markets, etc., but they don't do it because they don't want to be subject to these labor laws which are there. And again, that means that overall labor standards are less. So what we really need to do is to work tripartite structures involving the government, business and labor. I know we have very adversarial labor relations in this country, but countries like Germany, Japan, they have been able to achieve these tripartite structures where all three parties get together and are able to put Sri Lanka Incorporated as at the top of the list of priorities for all three parties, and then work out ways in which that there is a decent wage for labor and a decent rate of return for the investors. So this balance that we need in our labor legislation is something. At the moment, it's just too rigid. It has been more flexible, but clearly it has to be made more flexible in consultation with the labor movement. And the labor movement has to be responsible enough to understand that as a country, we have to be competitive, we can't be unreasonable in terms of costs, and we shouldn't deter investment by being too demanding in terms of protection. Equally, if you don't change, it is leading to lower overall labor standards in the country. So everybody has to, really, it has to be a tripartite effort to improve the labor laws in this country. Let me quickly, I'm running out of time, so let me quickly go. Some of the other things the government is doing is it's trying to improve the investment climate. There are 8 task forces which have been set up on 8 pillars of the World Bank's ease of doing business index. Sri Lanka is ranked number 109. But you can go up. India went up 30 places in 2016. So it's the kind of thing, if they can do 30, we can do easily, do 30 or more, I think. But there are these task forces which are looking at ways and means of improving the investment climate, where you have to take 6 steps to get a permit, to see whether you can reduce it to 3, where you can infuse technology to facilitate processes to do that. So that process is going on. And that program was launched in May of this year. In addition, investment promotion. The BOI in the past has just kind of sat back and facilitated people who came. Now, again, with this Harvard group, they're working to identify subsectors where we can have a comparative advantage. And then, within that subsectors, to attract anchor investors. For instance, Samsung accounted for 40% of Vietnam's exports at one point. Intel accounted for 75% of Costa Rica's exports at one point. So if you can get a few anchor investors into new subsectors in which you're competitive, that can transform your export performance very quickly. So the investment promotion effort is becoming more focused, and they are going to be much more proactive. They're also going to have trade facilitation, a single electronic window in customs where basically it's a paperless process which will facilitate things. That should be on stream hopefully by the middle of next year. And there's going to be also a trade portal which the Department of Commerce will put up where there'll be a lot of trade information. The potential jewel in the crown are these trade agreements or these partnership agreements Sri Lanka is negotiating. It already has a free trade agreement in goods with India. Now, it could be better, it could have been better, but it is not the failure it is sometimes said to be. People say that it's a failure because the trade deficit with India has gone up dramatically, which is true. But if you unpack the figures, what becomes apparent is that if you look at trade taking place under the FTA, that is trade that takes place on a preferential basis only, then the deficit is much, much less. Because 80% of our goods go into the Indian market on a preferential basis, and only about 20-25% of their goods come into our market on a preferential basis. So if you just look at the preferential trade, in fact, in the 16 years or 17 years the agreement has been in place, in 6 years we have actually had a surplus. Of course, that was during the time when there was this Vanaspati oil and a couple of other things which came about because of tariff arbitrage, which now is no longer possible. But all the same, if you just look at what happens on a preferential basis, the deficit is relatively small. The deficit is very big because India is the cheapest source of imports in a number of areas, motor cars and various things, motorcycles. So if we didn't import those things from India, okay, our bilateral trade deficit would be smaller, but our overall trade deficit would be bigger because we have to import from countries more expensive sources. So as I said, certainly there were non-tariff barriers which have meant that the bilateral FTA in goods has not worked as well as it could have done. The government is trying to have an earlier harvest of trying to address some of those tariff barriers. And it is also trying to extend the agreement in goods to services, to investment, technology, and training. And a similar agreement is being negotiated with China and Singapore. The agreement with Singapore will probably be signed within the next month or two. The other two, hopefully, by the middle of next year, but there is still some negotiation to do. Now, people get nervous when you talk about a small country like Sri Lanka negotiating with massive giants, particularly a country like China and also India. But there are well tried and tested ways through which the small country can protect itself. For instance, the positive list that countries put into the agreement, that is areas where they're going to liberalize. The larger country will have a much longer list because these agreements between small and large countries have to be based on two principles. One, of non-reciprocity, that the small country won't do the same amount as the large country, and special and differential treatment where the small country gets certain benefits, beneficial treatment. So the positive list, the negative list on goods will be much longer for Sri Lanka than it will be for India or China. Equally, the positive list for services will be, again, much smaller for Sri Lanka than for the larger country. Also, you can have what are called safeguard arrangements, whereby if there is a sudden surge in imports, you can immediately trigger tariffs. If there's a 10%, 15%, you can have a certain figure. If suddenly there's an increase in imports of a particular good, it can automatically trigger tariffs. So these are the kind of protective mechanisms you can have, and you can also have a good dispute resolution mechanism. So if you negotiate these things well, you can get benefits out of negotiations with large countries. And also it's much better to have a rules-based agreement, a rules-based trading regime with a much larger country, particularly if it's only 20 miles away. But if you don't have rules, it becomes actually much, much worse. Because that country, by sheer size and things like that, can come and all kinds of things that can happen which are not within your control. But if you have a rules-based trading regime, you have a better control over the outcomes. So if we are able to successfully negotiate these trade agreements, we would be the only country in the world which has preferential access to China, India, and the European Union through GSP. That is a massive differentiator. There are 190 countries all chasing foreign direct investment. Nobody else has preferential access to this market of over 3 billion people. So we can show this market, tell investors you come in Sri Lanka, export on a preferential basis to China, export on a preferential basis to India, export on a preferential basis to the EU. That is a narrative that nobody else is able to use. And clearly, so the benefits of these agreements is not only to increase opportunities for our exporters, but it enables us to leverage the nexus between trade and investment. By showing these preferential markets, we can get our investment in. So in my view, these trade agreements can be massively beneficial. Of course, we need to negotiate well, and also the government is putting in place certain measures to support these agreements, because there will be some liberalization, there will be some losers, and there's going to be a trade adjustment package to help companies which are affected to increase their competitiveness and for workers to get retraining. Similarly, they're also putting in place an anti-dumping legislation, which I think has just been presented to Parliament, so that these large countries can't come and dump stuff. So you're creating a better overall trading environment, and you're trying to negotiate deals which will give us significant benefits, in my view, if they're negotiated properly. Finally, some of the highlights of the government's development program. Obviously in the western province, the Western Region Megapolis project and the port city. Then Japan is doing a master plan for Kandy. And then in the Kurnaga and the Kuliyapiti area, particularly initially in Bingiria, there is going to be an economic zone where the Koreans and the Andhra Pradesh Development Corporation have shown an interest. Then you go down in Kalutara, there is a large Thai private sector company which is setting up an economic zone. Then you go down south in Dedua, there is supposed to be a high value tourism development. And there are some economic zones, small economic zones down south as well. And of course, Hambantota. Hambantota, in my view, the whole debate about the long lease of the port, in my view, was not framed appropriately. Clearly, one had to negotiate the best possible deal for the lease. But this is not just a port lease deal. It's about the development of an area which is a lagging region in the country. 69 years after independence, we have done very little for the people of Monragala, for the people of Uba. The people of Hambantota have assets which are not working for them. What this port deal does is it catalyzes investment into this area. Initially, the Chinese are going to build what they call 5 foundational industries. An LNG plant, a refinery, a cement factory, a steel billet factory, and a ship repair facility. So what they call them foundational industries because they're going to support the economic zone they want to build in that area. And of course, the economic zone, they've asked for 15,000 acres. I don't know if they can be 15,000 acres, but even if they have half that can potentially transform that area. And so, not only the Hambantota area, but people from Monragala, Uva, etc., can all, or even Matra, can move across and benefit from that area. Equally, there is a master plan being developed for Trincomalee by the same Singaporean consultancy, Subhana Durang, which did the Western Region Megapolis plan. And there the idea is for Japan, India and Singapore to work together to develop the area around Trincomalee. To have economic zones, residential and commercial, real estate, tourism, etc. And developing that Trincomalee area will provide opportunities for people from the Rajarata as well. They can move across. There are also special incentives from the north. The government is thinking of opening an industrial zone in Parandan, where the Parandan chemicals area. There's a large area there which they're trying to open up an industrial zone. And Achuveli, which already exists, for new companies setting up there, they're going to subsidize the electricity. Plus, the port and the airport are in the process of being rehabilitated. And the government has taken away a lot of the tax holidays, all the tax holidays, as a result of the new Indian Revenue Act. Instead, what you get are investment allowances. So you can write off 100% of your investment against tax. In the conflict-affected areas, you can write off 200% of your investment. So you already have 100% depreciation over 5 years. On top of that, you can do 100% write-off against tax in the non-conflict areas, and so that's 200%. In the conflict-affected areas, you can basically write off 300% of your profit. So that's a massive investment. But the incentive is focused on investment, on additional investment. So that's what the country needs, and to drive investment to generate growth and employment. So those are some of the main projects. So the macro stability growth model, which has to work, growth enhancing measures, and the main development programs. So the plans are pretty good. But what we now need to look at is execution. That's where the jury is still out, whether we can get it done. If we are able to do even half that stuff, this country will be a dramatically different place. Thank you very much.